Part 2.
Driving into Stalingrad, the Germans...
What happened in the trench in the war? This is what happened.
Something like this when we moved to Nashville and get...
The First World War was a brutal and depressing conflict, but because of the lack of video and audio...
The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the human race, in which over 40 million military... The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the human race, in which over 40 million military... The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the human race, in which over 40 million military... The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in the history of the human race, in which over 40 million military...
The First World War was a brutal and depressing conflict, but because of the lack of video and audio...
Over 40 million military men and civilians died. They endured disease, hunger, rats, horrific smells, corpses everywhere, and most importantly, they had to come to terms with the reality that they could die at any moment. Today we're going to find out what it was like to be a World War I trench soldier. But before we do, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know what historical events you would like to hear about. Now, on to the trenches. From October 1914 to March 1918, British, French, German, Russian, and Ottoman forces fought in trenches, an interconnected series of muddy paths dug about 7 feet deep and 6 feet wide into the ground at the front lines of the battlegrounds. While the trenches gave soldiers cover and protection from enemy fire, they also ironically were the cause of many deaths due to their sewer-like conditions. When you hear about the trenches of World War I, you might envision a bunch of crudely dug walkways, but these trenches had a purposeful, strategic design. The Allies and the Central Powers designed their trenches as a defense mechanism. Aggressive, heavy weapons forced both sides to hunker down, so trenches became a way to hold a line without making soldiers vulnerable. The trenches were also dug in zigzags and curves, which created corners and corridors, giving soldiers better vantage points and hiding spots. Those zigzag patterns kept infiltrating enemies from jumping into the trench and wiping out everyone in sight. And these trenches all served a different purpose. Some trenches served as holding corrals for troops on R&R. Some trenches were for supply storage, and other trenches were for waste. Something about being covered in soupy mud is fun. People pay good money to get slathered in organic mud at fancy day spas in the name of healthier skin. But during World War I, prolonged exposure to flooded, muddy trenches could cause trench foot. You could lose your toes, or worse, your feet. Trench foot was so rampant and commonplace, it impacted roughly 75,000 British soldiers alone. It was also discovered in World War I that soldiers gave each other regular foot inspections. The men would be paired up in twos, and each partner made responsible for the feet of the other, and they would generally apply whale oil in an effort to prevent trench foot. That could happen under all cold, wet conditions. As a matter of fact, some concert goers were reported to have developed trench foot at the Glastonbury festivals, the Leeds festivals, and Download festivals as a result of the consistent cold, wet, and muddy conditions at those events. Even though advanced medical techniques meant that doctors were better equipped to manage the health of soldiers in World War I than they had been in previous conflicts, it was still common for soldiers to simply get sick and die. The cold, damp, and unsanitary conditions in the trenches did nothing to fortify soldiers, and the unforgiving elements made them prone to illness. Lice circulated in the trenches and spread maladies like trench fever, and it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to wake up finding rats eating their rations. Or them. Yes, the rats were so bold, they'd take bites out of sleeping soldiers. And let's not forget that the trenches were the breeding ground for one of the deadliest outbreaks in history, the influenza pandemic of 1918. Due to World War I, soldiers' already low immune systems, weakened by malnourishment, as well as the stresses of combat and chemical attacks, their susceptibility to the disease was imminent. World War I changed on April 22, 1915, when German forces shocked Allied soldiers along the Western Front by firing more than 150 tons of lethal chlorine gas against two French colonial divisions at Ypres, Belgium. The United States, which entered World War I in 1917, also developed and used chemical weapons. Future President Harry S. Truman was the captain of a U.S. field artillery unit that fired poison gas against the Germans in 1918. All in, approximately 100,000 tons of chemical weapons were used in World War I, injuring around 500,000 troops and killing nearly 30,000 men, including 2,000 Americans. Gas attacks were terrifying. It was a new level of warfare that no one was expecting. A gas attack could severely injure or end anyone unlucky enough to come into proximity with it. It also could depend on how the breeze was blowing at that particular time. Soldiers weren't in the trenches 24/7 for months on end. Soldiers actually only spent between 1 and 7 days at a time in the trenches, in close reserve and at rest. This process limited the amount of time a soldier spent in the bleak trenches, and the rotation was incredibly important in managing their stress. Rest could be a misnomer, though. If regiments